A cold Atlantic wind slammed against the steel hull of the transport ship as it cut through dark waters, carrying a secret no one had expected: German women POWs, captured in the final chaotic months of the war, being transported to the very nation they had been taught to despise. Boots echoed against metal floors, chains rattled softly, and the hum of American engines reverberated like a heartbeat beneath their feet. Every woman on that deck had heard the same stories, that America was collapsing under its own weight, a place of disorder, weakness, and moral decay. Yet, as the coastline emerged from the fog, their breath caught in their throats. Massive cranes towered over the harbor like steel giants. Endless rows of vehicles glimmered under the morning sun. Supply lines moved with mechanical precision. And the American soldiers who stepped forward didn't shout, didn't shove, didn't treat them as trophies of war. They simply followed protocol, disciplined, calm, unshakably confident. One German woman whispered under her breath, "Das ist nicht möglich." And in that instant, the first crack appeared in the world they thought they understood. For months, these women had lived inside a fortress of propaganda, told that America was nothing more than a crude experiment destined to collapse. They were trained to believe that Americans had no discipline, no vision, no real military power, just noise masquerading as strength. But the moment the ship docked, the truth hit them with a force greater than any explosion they had ever heard on the battlefield. The air itself felt different, organized, structured, almost impossibly calm for a nation at war. The bases stretched farther than their eyes could see, humming with activity, trucks moving in neat lines, warehouses stacked with supplies, soldiers functioning like parts of a well-oiled machine. And as they were escorted down the ramp, their fear slowly mixed with something far more unsettling: awe. This was not the America they were promised. This was a superpower revealing its muscle without even trying. And as the women were guided into the heart of the U.S. military system, one truth became undeniable: history had lied to them, and now they were walking straight into the reality that would change everything they thought they knew. The final days of the war had turned Europe into a collapsing world of smoke, dust, and broken loyalties. German units were scattered, disorganized, and desperately trying to hold on to lines that no longer existed. And in the middle of this chaos, a small detachment of German women communications operators, nurses, auxiliary personnel found themselves surrounded by an American force they never expected to encounter, so deep behind what they believed was secure territory. The capture happened with stunning efficiency. There was no dramatic firefight, no last stand, just a swift, disciplined maneuver from American troops who moved with a precision the women had only heard about in rumors. The women expected hostility, humiliation, maybe even violence. Instead, they were met with clipped instructions, respectful handling, and a silence that felt more intimidating than any shouted order. When they were told they would be transported across the Atlantic, terror crept through their ranks. Propaganda had painted a clear image. American ships were brutal places where prisoners were treated like animals. But from the moment they boarded the transport, the picture began cracking. The ship was clean, not luxurious, but organized. The guards were alert, but never unnecessarily aggressive. The women were given rations, medical checks, and a structured routine that felt strangely methodical. At night, they lay in tightly spaced bunks, listening to the thrum of giant engines powering them into an unknown world. Whispers drifted through the darkness: fear of the unknown, fear of what America would do to them, fear of everything they had been taught. Days blended together, the ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a reminder that there was no going back. Some women stared at the horizon until their eyes burned. Others held on to their uniforms as if they were the last pieces of home. And yet, as the journey continued, another feeling began to rise: confusion. Why were the Americans treating them by rules? Why was everything so structured, so calm? It didn't match the image drilled into their minds for years. But the real shock, the moment that would stay with them for the rest of their lives, waited on the other side of the ocean, beyond the first thin outline of the American coast, appearing like an approaching truth they could no longer deny. The moment the coastline sharpened into detail, every German woman on deck froze. What they saw wasn't the broken, collapsing America they had been warned about. Instead, the port stretched out in a breathtaking display of order and industrial strength. Massive cranes moved with slow, deliberate power. Cargo trucks rolled in synchronized lines. Soldiers communicated with hand signals, headsets, and an efficiency that looked almost mechanical. The women exchanged stunned glances. This wasn't possible. This wasn't the enemy they were told would crumble at the first pressure. As the ship edged into position and anchored, American military police stepped forward. Their uniforms were crisp, boots polished, faces calm. They didn't push, scream, or show triumph. They simply executed procedures one step, one instruction at a time. When the German women descended the ramp, the clean concrete under their boots felt like another world. The smell of fuel, metal, and fresh coastal air hit them all at once. Some felt their knees weaken. One woman muttered, barely audible, "Das ist nicht möglich." Another whispered back, "If this is the beginning, what else have they hidden from us?" The Americans formed neat rows, escorting them through processing areas. Everything ran like a machine: registration desks, medical stations, documentation tables. The Germans were stunned by the discipline: no confusion, no shouting, no delay. It was the kind of order they had believed only Germany could achieve. But here it was bigger, smoother, more powerful. As they were moved through the facility, they caught glimpses of something even more overwhelming: endless warehouses stacked with supplies, vehicles arranged with military precision, barracks stretching farther than they could see. A few of the women found themselves staring in open shock at the sheer scale of American logistics. Trucks loaded with crates rolled by every few minutes, each one part of a supply chain that looked impossible to disrupt. Back home, shortages were everywhere. Here, abundance seemed to be the norm. For the first time, the women felt not just fear, but insignificance. They were standing inside a system so vast and organized that even the idea of Germany matching it felt like a distant fantasy. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the enormous base, the women realized something quietly devastating. The war they thought they understood was built on lies, and now they were walking directly into the truth. The drive to the POW camp took hours, but every minute revealed a new layer of American power. Highways stretched farther than they thought possible. Factories pumped out smoke in steady waves. Railroad lines carried endless trains of supplies: ammunition, food, fuel, everything needed to sustain a global war effort. By the time the women reached the camp, their minds were already reeling. But nothing prepared them for what they found inside. The camp wasn't a wooden cage or a miserable wasteland. It was structured, clean, and surprisingly humane. Fences and guard towers stood tall, but everything inside was systematically arranged: barracks, mess halls, medical stations, and work areas. The guards followed a strict code. They issued instructions respectfully, kept interactions professional, and maintained discipline without unnecessary cruelty. The women had expected humiliation, perhaps even retaliation. Instead, they were treated according to rules written, enforced, and taken seriously. During their first meal, they stared at the plates in disbelief. Soup, potatoes, bread, simple but warm. Back in Germany, even civilians were struggling to find basic food. Here, prisoners were being fed on schedule. Some women felt anger rise: how could the enemy have so much while their families starved? Others felt shame, a few felt relief. But all of them felt something they didn't expect: confusion that tasted almost like gratitude. The cultural shock deepened with each passing day. American guards played jazz on radios as they patrolled. Women heard laughter from the barracks at night, guards teasing each other, sharing stories, joking casually in a way that felt impossible during war. The POWs were allowed to write letters home. They were assigned work tasks: laundry, cooking, farming tasks that brought routine and normalcy back into lives stripped bare by conflict. And everywhere they looked, they saw abundance: food supplies were stocked. Vehicles were fueled. Medicine was available. Tools were plentiful. It became painful to realize that the enemy they had envisioned as weak, chaotic, and undisciplined was the exact opposite. America wasn't struggling to survive the war, it was powering through it. And the women began to understand that the stories they grew up believing were not just wrong, they were propaganda designed to blind them. Now, inside this strange, orderly, shockingly humane camp, their entire worldview was slowly being dismantled. Weeks passed, then months, and with each new day, the German women POWs found themselves confronting a truth they could no longer ignore. America's power wasn't loud or boastful. It didn't need to be. It showed itself in the simplest, most consistent ways, in the food lines that never ran empty, in the medical care that never skipped a patient, in the constant hum of trucks and machinery moving like blood through the veins of a giant. The women began to talk quietly at night, sharing their observations. The same question echoed through every whispered conversation: if this is how America treats its prisoners, what must its army look like on the battlefield? One woman, a former propaganda clerk, broke down one evening. Her voice cracked as she admitted, everything we were told, everything, was designed to keep us blind. No one argued. There was nothing left to argue. Evidence surrounded them every day. The camp wasn't a place of luxury, far from it. But its efficiency, its stability, its abundance, and its discipline made Germany's crumbling war effort feel like a fading shadow. Some women wrestled with guilt, others with anger, a few with quiet admiration. They weren't betraying their homeland, they were accepting reality. A reality that had been hidden behind speeches and posters. A reality their leaders had forbidden them to see. The moment of true understanding arrived unexpectedly. A massive convoy rolled past the camp, dozens of American vehicles carrying equipment to another base. The trucks moved in coordinated formation. Soldiers sat upright, focused, prepared. The German women watched in silence. It wasn't the hardware that stunned them. It was the calmness, the confidence, the sense that this was routine, not a showcase. One woman whispered, "We never had a chance," not said in defeat, but in revelation. And with that quiet statement, the truth crystallized. America's military power didn't come from ideology. It came from structure, discipline, resources, and a united industrial machine unlike anything Germany could match. The war was already decided long before they were captured. They were simply among the few who would witness the truth with their own eyes. And long after the conflict ended, many of these women would carry a memory they could never escape: the exact moment they realized the world they believed in had already vanished. The days eventually blended into one another, and the war that had reshaped continents slowly drew to its inevitable end. But for these German women POWs, the end of the conflict was not the end of their transformation. It was only the beginning of a truth they would carry for the rest of their lives. They had arrived on American soil expecting brutality, chaos, and the collapse of an enemy they'd been taught to mock. Instead, they found a nation operating with an unshakable rhythm, a military system that didn't need cruelty to assert dominance, and a society capable of feeding millions while fighting on distant fronts. The contrast between what they had believed and what they witnessed felt almost surreal, as if they had stepped out of one world and directly into another. When repatriation finally began, many of the women walked toward the transport trucks in silence, each step heavier than the last. They weren't returning home with pride or victory. They were returning with questions about truth, about power, about the stories leaders tell their people to keep them obedient. Some carried guilt, others carried shame. A few carried a strange mix of admiration and sorrow, but all of them carried clarity. They had seen what their nation had tried to hide from them, and that knowledge would outlive every speech, every poster, every lie they had ever been taught. As the gates closed behind them for the last time, a single thought seemed to echo in the quiet morning air. Strength did not always roar, it often worked quietly, consistently, relentlessly. America had shown them that. Not through cruelty, not through dominance, but through order, discipline, and a vast, unstoppable machinery of power that didn't need to announce itself. And long after the war's fires were extinguished, these women would remember one defining moment, the day they stepped onto U.S. soil as enemies, and realized they had entered a world far stronger, far larger, and far more truthful than they had ever imagined.